The first thing Yara remembered about the ship was the smell. Not metal, not antiseptic, not anything a human engineer would have chosen. It was something older, something that pressed itself into the soft tissue behind her eyes and settled there like pollen, organic, almost floral. The kind of scent that lives in the back of your throat and refuses to leave, that you find yourself breathing around instead of through. She had been awake for 11 seconds before the smell reached her, and those 11 seconds were the last clean ones she would have for a very long time. She did not move. This was not a choice she made consciously. Her body had decided before she was fully present in it. The surface beneath her was warm. Not the warmth of machinery or heated panels, but the warmth of something living, something that exhaled in slow rhythms she could feel in her shoulder blades. The light above her was pale and diffuse, the color of skim milk poured over old bone, and it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, sourceless and complete. And there were sounds, soft ones, the kind you had to stop breathing to hear. Liquid moving through tubes, something clicking in a patient, unhurried way. Instruments she had no name for, doing things she had no framework to understand. She tracked all of this without opening her eyes. Yara Osei had been a xenobiological researcher for the United Earth Survey Corps for 9 years before the Keth took her. She had spent those 9 years cataloging alien life in the margins of explored space, collecting samples, writing papers that 14 other scientists in the universe would ever read. She was not a soldier. She was not special operations. She was not trained for capture or resistance, or any of the dramatic scenarios they covered in the mandatory survival seminar. She had attended twice and then stopped attending because the coffee was bad. What she was trained for was observation. So she lay still on the warm surface that breathed, and she observed 3 beings in the room, maybe 4. One of the presences was difficult to locate, its movements so economical that she could only detect it by the slight changes in air pressure when it passed. The others were easier. One stood close, perhaps 2 meters, its breathing a shallow cycle with a long pause at the top, like a bellows held at full extension before release. Another moved intermittently along what she guessed was the far wall, the clicking sound tracking with it, each movement precise and purposeful. She had read about the Keth. Everyone had. The first contact 11 years ago had produced an enormous amount of documentation and almost no real information, because the Keth did not communicate the way humans communicated, and because everything they chose to share was either a warning or an invitation, and it was almost impossible to tell which was which until well after the fact. What the U.S. knew for certain, they were old, older than human spaceflight, older than human writing, possibly older than human bipedalism. They did not have ships the way humans had ships. They had structures that moved through space, structures that were partly grown and partly constructed and partly neither, structures that responded to the Keth the way a body responds to its own nervous system. What they did with humans they captured. Nobody knew. The ships that returned carried no survivors. The 2 researchers who'd transmitted data from inside Keth space before going silent had sent fragments, images mostly, that the U.S. had classified and then reclassified and then quietly buried. Yara had seen one of those images passed to her by a colleague who'd had access before the classification went up. She had never been able to fully describe what she'd seen to anyone, because the part of her brain that processed it had simply declined to produce language. She cataloged all of this without opening her eyes, and she decided to keep not opening them for a little longer. The presence that was closest to her moved. She felt it before she heard it. A change in temperature, something warmer approaching, and then the sound of something being poured. Liquid, slightly viscous by the sound of it, settling into a container near her head. The smell shifted. The floral organic baseline didn't go away, but something layered over it now, something that smelled the way bioluminescence looked, cool and self-contained and faintly electric. Then contact. Something touched the back of her left hand. Not a grip, not a restraint. A touch so careful it was almost not there at all. The lightest possible application of pressure. A single point of contact at the juncture between her 3rd and 4th metacarpals. And then it moved, and then it stopped. And she understood somehow that this was not examination. It was more deliberate than examination. It had intention behind it, the way a brushstroke has intention, the way the first mark on a canvas means something different from every mark that follows. She was a subject. She'd always known this intellectually, that if the Keth took humans, they did something with them. Now she knew it the way she knew the temperature of the surface beneath her. which was to say in her body, in the place below language where information becomes real. She was a subject in an experiment she had no context for, conducted by beings who had no obligation to explain themselves, using methods she could not anticipate. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was high. Cathedral high, she thought immediately, and then understood why. The structure around her had the proportions of a vast religious space, its upper reaches lost in the same sourceless pale light that surrounded her. But the walls, what should have been stone or metal or composite, were something she had no word for. Translucent in places and opaque in others, they shifted as she watched, the opacity moving through them in slow waves the way clouds move, or thoughts. She could see shapes beyond them, indistinct, the shadows of things arranged in ways that suggested purpose without revealing it. She turned her head, slowly, deliberately. The Keth researcher nearest to her was taller than the descriptions she'd read, though the descriptions were vague enough that she supposed anything would be taller than described. Its body had the quality of something that had decided to be a body, the way a decision is a thing before it becomes an action. Present, considered, not entirely committed to any single form. She watched it and thought cephalopod, she thought mantis, she thought neither of those things. She thought, I am a xenobiologist and I genuinely have no referent for this organism, and that is the most interesting and most terrifying thing I have ever felt at the same time. It was looking at her. She was not certain it had eyes in the way she had eyes, but it was looking at her. She felt the quality of its attention, the way you feel the sun on the back of your neck, warmly and with certainty, without needing to turn around. She said, in a voice that was steadier than she expected, "Hello." The Keth did not respond. She had not expected it to. But she watched something move through its body when she spoke. Not a flinch, not surprise, but a kind of registering. The way a seismometer doesn't react to an earthquake, it records it. She had been catalogued. The researcher turned back to the arrangement of containers and instruments near her head. She watched it work. This was, she decided, the only thing she could do with any competence right now, and so she was going to do it with everything she had. The containers were translucent, the same quality as the walls, and they held substances of varying densities and colors. Not colors, exactly. The substances had a relationship to color the way music has a relationship to mathematics. Structurally connected, but experientially different. She watched the Keth researcher select one container, tilt it with a precision that seemed absolute, and allow a small quantity of its contents to settle onto what appeared to be a flat surface near her left arm. And then it touched her again. The same point on her hand, but this time with the substance. She felt it on her skin and thought, warm. Thought, pressure. Thought, several seconds later, with a kind of alarm she worked to keep out of her breathing, my hand feels different than it did. Not painful, not damaged. Different in the way you feel different after you've been in cold water for a long time and then come back to room temperature. A recalibration, a resetting of what the nervous system had decided was baseline. Her hand felt more present than it had a moment ago, more itself. As if something had been turned up by a few degrees without her permission. She filed this away. She kept watching. Over the next period, she had no way to measure time. Her watch was gone. There was no observable cycle of light in this space. The Keth researcher worked with the methodical patience of someone who had done this before and expected to do it many more times. It applied substances to different points on her body with that same exquisite precision. The palm of her right hand, the hollow of her collarbone, the thin skin behind her ear, which it found with an accuracy that told her the anatomy of her body was not unknown to it. Each application was different. Each produced in her a different quality of sensation, a different flavor of presence. She was being rewritten, she understood. Not damaged, not harmed. Rewritten. The way you rewrite a document when you want to change what it says without destroying the paper. And she understood something else. Something that came to her slowly and arrived with the weight of real knowledge rather than theory. They did not know she was aware. The two researchers she could see, there was a third she'd since located by sound in the near left quadrant, were not behaving as though their subject was conscious. They were behaving the way she had behaved 10,000 times in 9 years of fieldwork. Focused, efficient, present to the work, and absent to everything else. The quality of their movement said, this thing on the surface is inert. This thing is a subject, which is a category that does not include aware. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about Helmholtz. It was a strange thing to think about. in the circumstances, but her brain had gone to him, and she'd learned to trust her brain's tangents in fieldwork, because the tangents usually led somewhere. Hermann von Helmholtz, 19th century, human, dead for 130 years, who had written, "Everything is an event on the skin, not a metaphor, a statement of mechanism. The skin is where the world meets the self. Every sensation is the world reaching through the barrier of the body and leaving a mark." The Keth were doing something to her skin. They were trying to change what the world could reach through her body, what it could mark, what marks would be left. They were trying to change what she was, from the outside in. She thought, they have never had one of us awake before. She thought, that's something. On the fourth cycle, she'd started counting the researcher's movements as a proxy for time. Each complete circuit of the space she designated one cycle. The Keth brought the substance she'd been waiting for. She'd known it was coming because the preparation changed. There was a quality of arrival in the way the researcher moved, the way it consulted the arrangement of containers with a deliberateness it hadn't used before. A ceremony within a procedure. Whatever this was, it mattered to them. The container was smaller than the others. The substance inside it had no color she could name and moved the way shadows move when clouds pass over them. Not quite fluid, not quite particulate, something in between. The researcher lifted it with both of its primary manipulation surfaces. Yara had given up on human anatomical terms for its limbs 40 minutes ago and held it, and for a moment was very still. She watched the third Keth, the one she'd located in the near left quadrant, move slightly forward. Attention. Even they were attending to this. The researcher tilted the container, brought it toward her face, toward her mouth. They were going to give it to her to swallow. The realization arrived with perfect clarity, and with it, the thing they did not know. The thing that was her one advantage in a situation where she had very few advantages. They didn't know she was awake. They didn't know she had been aware and cataloging for however many hours she'd been in this space. They had never had a conscious human subject, and so they had never developed protocols for one, which meant there were things they had not accounted for. She let them not account for those things for approximately 3 more seconds. Then she moved. Not the lunge a soldier would have made, not the explosive motion of a person trained to fight. She moved the way a researcher moves when a sample is about to be lost, fast, specific, targeted. She sat up, and in the same motion she closed her right hand around the container, and she looked directly at the nearest Keth's face, whatever its face was, and she said, in a voice she kept level with everything she had, "I need to understand what this is before I take it." The stillness that followed was unlike any stillness she'd experienced in 9 years of alien contact. The Keth researcher did not move. The container was between them, her hand on it, its manipulation surfaces on it, neither of them holding it alone. She could feel it between them. The substance inside it, shifting as though aware of the change in dynamics, the small movements of something that had been calibrated to be administered and was now in contention. She waited. She had read, in the classified documents she wasn't supposed to have read, that the Keth communicated in a way that was fundamentally untranslatable because it was not symbolic. It was not sounds arranged into patterns, or patterns arranged into meanings. It was direct transmission of internal state, which was why the 2 researchers who'd transmitted data before going silent had struggled so badly to describe it, and why one of them had used the word weather in 3 consecutive transmissions as though she couldn't find another term. Communication, like weather, like climate, you felt it before you understood it, and you understood it before you could name it. Yara felt the communication now. It was not language. It was a sudden quality of attention from all 3 Keth in the room, convergent and total, the way sunlight converges through a lens. She felt understood not in the sense of comprehended, but in the sense of seen. Fully, completely, all at once, every layer she had, the frightened researcher and the observing one and the one who'd decided 3 seconds ago to take the container, all of them visible at the same time. She did not look away. She said, "I have been awake for the entire procedure. I watched everything you did. I can tell you what I felt and what I observed in detail if you can find a way to receive that information. But I need to understand what this does to me before I agree to it." She was bargaining. She knew she was bargaining. She had nothing to bargain with except exactly this. Information they didn't have, couldn't have gotten any other way, could only get from a human who had been conscious for the entire process and had the kind of mind that noticed things. 9 years of fieldwork. 9 years of noticing things nobody else was trained to notice. She said, I'm a xenobiologist. I study things I don't understand. I think we might be able to do that for each other. Another stillness. This one different in quality from the first. Less frozen, more thinking. She felt it the way you feel a barometric change before a storm, the way something in the atmosphere shifts before the rain. The Keth researcher released the container. Yara held it. She looked at the substance inside it, the colorless, almost fluid thing that moved like thought, and she took the first real breath she'd taken since opening her eyes, and she thought, okay, you're a xenobiologist. You study things you don't understand. Start from the beginning. She set the container on the surface beside her. Carefully, in the same deliberate way the researcher had set down its own instruments, the way you handle a thing you intend to return to. Not discarding it, postponing it on her own terms. Tell me about your skin, she said. It was an absurd thing to say. She knew it was absurd. But the researcher had moved its attention to her own skin during the preceding hours in a way that suggested skin mattered to the Keth, in a way that went beyond the biological. And Helmholtz was still in her head. Everything is an event on the skin. And she had learned in 9 years of fieldwork that when something won't leave your head in the field, it's because it's trying to tell you something useful. The nearest Keth extended what she'd been thinking of as a manipulation surface and pressed it, very gently, against the back of her left hand, the spot they'd been working on for hours. The first place they'd touched her. She felt it. Not just the physical contact, but the other thing, the weather communication, arriving through the point of contact with a directness that bypassed her language centers entirely and arrived somewhere older. It was not words. It was not images. It was something that she later, when she had the time and distance to try to name it, would call recognition. She had spent 9 years in the margins of explored space, collecting samples of things that couldn't speak to her, cataloging organisms that had no interest in being cataloged, writing papers about the shape of life in places humans weren't meant to go. She had spent 9 years trying to understand things from the outside. The Keth, she understood now, had spent far longer doing the same. They were not torturers. They were not conquerors, not in the way the U.S. briefing suggested. They were. She felt this with the certainty of the body rather than the mind, the certainty that doesn't require argument. Researchers, extremely old researchers, operating by methods so far outside human experience that there was no framework in which their work could look like anything other than violation. They had been trying to understand humans the only way they knew how. Because the only way they knew how was what they'd been doing, because no human had ever been awake to offer them another way. She thought, how many have they taken? She thought, how many could have said, I've been watching, and didn't? She thought, this is what I have. This is the only thing I have, and I'm going to use every gram of it. She pressed her hand back against the Keth researcher's manipulation surface. She said, okay, here's what I felt, and she told them. She told them everything, from the smell when she woke up, to the quality of the warmth beneath her, to the 11 seconds before the smell reached her, to every sensation they had produced on her skin in every sequence of the procedure. She described it the way she described alien samples, without judgment, without comparison to anything familiar, only in terms of what was present, what changed, what persisted. She spoke for a long time. She spoke until her voice got rough, and she had to stop. And the third Keth, the one in the near left quadrant, produced something liquid that it set beside her, and she drank it, and she kept talking. The Keth did not speak, but she felt their attention like a hand on the back of her neck, not threatening, not restraining, present, receiving. She had been a subject. She had decided, in the same motion she'd used to take the container, to become a collaborator instead. She did not know if this was possible. She did not know if the Keth had a category for it. She did not know if anything she said was landing in any way that would help her, or help the other humans they had taken, or help anyone. But she kept talking, because it was the only thing she had. Because it was specifically, precisely, irreducibly human, this insistence on being seen, this refusal to be merely acted upon, this stubbornness that said, if you want to understand me, you are going to have to let me be understood on my own terms. When she finally stopped, the silence was different from all the silences before it. The Keth researcher picked up the small container with the colorless substance, held it out to her, the same gesture as before. But it felt different now. It felt like a question rather than a procedure. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought of Helmholtz. She thought of 9 years of samples she'd collected from things that couldn't consent to being collected from, and how she'd done it carefully and without malice, and how that hadn't made it any less a taking. She thought of all the humans they'd brought here, and what they had been trying to understand, these ancient researchers, with their patient methods and their untranslatable communications. She thought of the researchers' manipulation surface against the back of her hand and the thing that had arrived through that contact. Recognition, she'd called it, and it still seemed like the right word. She took the container. She looked at the nearest Keth. She said, "I want to know what this does. I want a full record, and I want to be able to send a message to my people telling them I'm alive and that this is." She paused, looking for a word. "Ongoing. Research. That I'm doing research." She had no way to enforce any of this. She knew she had no way to enforce any of this. But the Keth had released the container when she asked, and they had given her something to drink when her voice gave out, and they had received everything she said with an attention that felt, in whatever Keth terms applied, like respect. The nearest researcher did something with its body that she couldn't fully see. She felt the communication again, not words, not images, just weather, just the sense of something settling into place. A decision made, a thing agreed to. She uncapped the container. The substance inside moved the way she'd watched it move for the past few minutes, not quite fluid, not quite anything, and the smell that came from it was the same floral electric smell that had been the first thing she knew on this ship. The smell of whatever this place was, the smell of old intelligent life doing what intelligent life does. She thought, 9 years of field work, she thought, I have been in worse situations than this, and in exactly 0 of those situations did my job turn out to be useless. She thought, briefly, of her mother, who had wanted her to study something practical, who had never understood what drove her to the margins of explored space, who had said on the night before Yara left for her first survey mission, "What are you looking for out there?" And Yara had said, "Things I don't understand yet." And her mother had shaken her head and laughed and kissed her on the forehead and said, "That sounds like you, baby. That sounds exactly like you." She tipped the container and drank. It tasted the way she'd known it would. Not like anything she could name. Something that arrived on the tongue, and then arrived somewhere else, somewhere slightly interior of the tongue, somewhere that wasn't the mouth exactly, but wasn't not the mouth. She felt it move through her in the way she'd felt the topical applications move through the relevant patches of her skin. A resetting, a recalibration, a small and precise change to what she'd been before. Everything is an event on the skin. She sat with what she felt, and she started, in her head, writing the paper, not for 14 scientists, for whoever came next, for whatever U.S. survey ship eventually found this vessel, for the humans who would follow her here, and there would be humans who followed, because humans were unreasonably stubborn in that specific way, in the way of showing up in places they weren't built for and refusing to be solely acted upon. She would write about the smell. She would write about the warm surface that breathed. She would write about the researcher and its patients and the 12 different substances and what each of them had felt like on different kinds of skin in different places on the body. She would write about what she'd felt when the researcher touched the back of her hand and the thing that had arrived through that contact that she was still calling recognition for want of a better word. She would write, "They are researchers. They have been trying to understand us the only way they know how." She would write, "They didn't know we could talk back." She would write, "They do now." The Keth researcher set out a new arrangement of containers. This time, Yara noticed, it placed one of the flat surfaces close to her own hands, within her reach, accessible. She understood that she was being invited to observe more closely, to handle, to indicate her own curiosity about the materials. She reached out and touched the nearest container. She felt the researcher's attention change, a brightening, the way a room gets brighter when a door opens to the outside. She understood she had done something right, not correct by their procedure, but right in some other sense, a sense that both species apparently shared, the rightness of a living thing engaging with genuine curiosity instead of fear. She thought, that's the start. She thought, that's the actual, real start. She pulled the container closer and looked at what was inside it and thought, I don't understand this yet. And for the first time since she'd woken up in this place, she smiled. Outside the vast cathedral walls of the vessel, space was doing what space does, providing context. Stars burned with their ancient indifference. The U.S. survey ship that had been tracking her beacon for 17 days was 12 hours out, its crew debating protocols for what they might find, running scenarios that included recovery of remains and scenarios that included nothing at all. Because nobody had ever found a human alive in Keth space, because nobody had ever established communication that went past warning or invitation, because nobody had ever been in the position Yara was in. In 12 hours, they would receive a transmission. It would be brief. It would be transmitted in standard U.S. emergency code, which the Keth had apparently been able to access from the communication equipment they'd taken with Yara because they were very old and very capable, and had decided, in whatever passed for a Keth decision, to allow it. The transmission would say, "I am alive. I am conducting research. This is ongoing. Do not engage with weapons. Repeat, do not engage." And then, because she was Yara Osei, and because 9 years of fieldwork had made her constitutionally incapable of leaving the important part out, it would also say, "I think we've been making the same mistake with them that they've been making with us. I'll explain when I can. Stand by." She had woken up in this place as a subject, a specimen, a sleeping body on a warm surface in a repurposed cathedral, surrounded by patient researchers who had never expected her to do anything except receive. She had decided, in the 11 seconds before the smell reached her, in the instant before she opened her eyes, to be something else instead. Not a soldier, not a hero. Something harder than both of those, in its way. A scientist who refused to stop doing science just because the conditions had gotten unusual. Everything is an event on the skin. She'd tell them about Helmholtz, she thought. Eventually. When the translation worked better. When the weather communication was something she could participate in instead of just receive. She'd tell them about the 19th century human who had understood what they seemed to have understood for much, much longer. That sensation is the site of meeting. That the body is the interface between self and world. That every contact between two things leaves a mark on both. She would tell them, "We've known this too. We just usually write it down instead of doing it to each other." She reached for another container. In 12 hours, two species would begin something that neither of them had a word for yet. The survey ship crew would stand by as instructed, bewildered and frightened and holding their fire, because the message had said so, and because it was signed with Yara's ID code, and because, as the captain would later record in the mission log, it sounded exactly like her. And in the cathedral vessel moving through the dark, a xenobiologist and 3 ancient researchers would work side by side at an arrangement of containers and instruments, conducting the kind of science that requires 2 parties who are equally curious about each other and equally stubborn about being understood. The smell in the room was still floral, still organic, still the smell of very old intelligent life doing what it had always done. It had a different quality now. She couldn't name it yet. She was working on it.